afternoon and welcome to our Change the Game Not Africa podcast. This discussion is part of the IDEC PBL Change the Game Not Africa project. I'm Zsófia Bárcai Bayan, currently attending Corvinus University and studying international relations. I'm also a trainee at the Foundation for Africa. My guest for this podcast is Réka BALOGH, who has been working for the Hungarian Association of NGOs for Development and Humanitarian Aid over 20 years. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Could you please tell a little bit more about yourself?
Thanks a lot for inviting me, and hi to all the listeners. My name is Réka BALOGH. I work for the Hungarian Association of NGOs for Development and Humanitarian Aid. As you told, yes, almost or more than 20 years now in various capacities. Previously, when there was only one employee, then I was the only one, the kind of coordinator or director of the organization. And later on, I started developing an interest in the policy area of the work. So nowadays, for the last, I think, 10, 12 years, I've been always involved in such kind of activities which are related in some way or the other to the policy arena of international development cooperation. During the last couple of years, I've been also dealing with questions, mainly policy issues related to global citizenship education, which is a related kind of area of education.
Oh, that's quite interesting. Thank you. Well, our aim with this podcast is to find out what are the aspects of international development cooperation work and how does this type of work change maybe a person's attitude towards the world, and who would you recommend it for? So to start the whole discussion, could you please elaborate us a little bit on Hungary's international development cooperation work?
Yes, a little bit. Actually, when we talk about international development or development cooperation, there's a basic notion we deal with. That's the notion of the developed and underdeveloped regions of the world. Development cooperation is a kind of activity, or if we are talking about government policies, a policy area which is aimed at improving the lives of people, individuals, and of course of societies worldwide. If we talk about development goals, we can think of, and maybe that's well known or a little bit known to our listeners as well, the goals like Sustainable Development Goals. They have been approved in 2015, and basically we have 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and they kind of cover almost all the areas or sectors of potential development in a society or in the life of a country or in the life of a people. So SDGs are related to health, to social sector, to climate change, to democracy, so many sorts of things. It can be viewed as a kind of complex system of goals which are aimed at to kind of improve and develop the life of people living in a bit underdeveloped or less developed parts of the world. In that sense, Hungary is now considered a donor. That is underlined by the fact that it has become the member of the EU, first of all, but on the other hand of OECD as well. And being the part of OECD, that means that we are a country of the developed world. And by also becoming the member of the so-called DAC committee, the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, we also have undertaken those type of initiatives which we can consider international development. And basically, we have also committed ourselves to spend a certain amount of our state budget on international development and humanitarian assistance. So in that sense, I think it's a very important abbreviation or a kind of phenomena in the international development cooperation world is the so-called official development assistance, which is abbreviated like ODA. So I might also use that abbreviation quite a lot during our conversation, because it's one of the cornerstones of development cooperation. So that basically stands for the kind of budget allocations of governments spent on humanitarian and development aid. As for Hungary, we are quite a relatively new donor, in the sense that before the political changes, we had ties to socialist countries, specifically in Africa, and we provided certain types of usually technical assistance to these countries. So that could have been also considered as development cooperation and official development assistance, but of course that was a completely different era. After the political changes, for quite some time, there was no such initiative or program undertaken, specifically not at the scale like nowadays. So from about 2002, 2003, the kind of official development cooperation activity or program of Hungary was established and started again. So for like 20 years, it's been going on. And from the same point of time, usually we can say that CSO, civil society organizations, or maybe better known NGOs, non-governmental organizations, are also part of the process. If we talk about Hungarian official development assistance, how we now I don't know the how we perform as official donors. Actually, we are in Europe, in the European Union, among the donors or new donors, which are performing quite well, in the sense that the old donors, like, I don't know, Luxembourg, Sweden, the UK, they almost reach that ratio of 0.7 ODA GNI ratio, which is the kind of benchmark for international donors to allocate from their state budget. In our case, as new member states and new members of the OECD, of course, nobody accepts us to have such high level of international development assistance. But at the same time, among the new EU member states, we are, I think, the second after Malta, because we have 0.29% of ODA GNI ratio. Basically, that is the ratio against the gross national income. How many percentages of your gross national income you spent on development assistance as ODA. So in that sense, we perform quite well as new donors. The question is always, after the volume, how you spent it, how efficiently, how effectively you spend that money. So in that sense, I think we still have a lot to improve in. But at the same time, I think in Europe, in the European Union, among the member states, we don't have to feel ashamed of this type of performance.
Yeah, as far as I know, our amount, the budget that has been allocated for international development cooperation has quadrupled over the last decade, if I know it well.
Yeah, no. That's correct. That's correct.
Would you say, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go on.
Would you say that Africa is a key region in Hungary's development policy?
From one aspect, you can say that. From other aspects, it's absolutely not the case. If you look at the government spending, then you can see that majority of the amount of ODA is spent in Europe, in middle-income countries. Specifically now with the war in Ukraine, definitely Ukraine is almost among the first 2-3 target countries of Hungarian ODA. Serbia is another one, and with the Arab Spring, definitely that region features quite high on the priority list as well. But of course, there are ties to Africa too. But if you compare it with the amount spent in Europe, in for example, Ukraine and Serbia and in other regions, it's not that important. It's absolutely growing, the amount is, and the percentage also going to Africa is growing, constantly growing, again, parallel to this unprecedented growth of total ODA during the last couple of years, like 5 to 6 years. So it means that definitely Africa is becoming more and more important target region for Hungarian ODA. But at the same time, if you look at the current numbers, you can see that, for example, in the 10 most important target countries, only 4 African countries feature. And if you also compare the amount of ODA going there, definitely it's a lower amount. So in that sense, again, I think we still have a lot to improve.
Oh, I see. I know that there are a couple of quite a couple of non-governmental organizations working from Hungary in Africa. What would you say? What role do NGOs play in international development cooperation?
Well, actually, the first question always comes to my mind is which NGOs, the donor country NGOs from Hungary or the local NGOs, because both local and donor country NGOs could play quite an important role in their own development as local NGOs or in the development of other countries if it's a donor country-based NGO. If we talk about both categories, definitely you can think of them as implementers of projects, of programs in developing countries. So you go there, you build a hospital, or you go there and build the capacity of other civil society organizations like local NGOs. You carry out a complex community development project in the local context. So in that sense, you kind of deliver services, you build, for example, infrastructure there, so you act as a kind of implementer. But besides that, there are other roles NGOs can take up, like if you work in awareness raising or in campaigning, you can do that again in your donor context, like in Europe or in Hungary. But at the same time, you can also go there or cooperate with local NGOs and do some kind of awareness raising activity, campaigning, communication, press work, whatever is required related to your work. Besides that, you can also advocate for certain issues. If, for example, in Africa, we take the example of land rights, who owns the land and who has access to land, if it's in the sector of agriculture, it's a very important question. If it's related to minerals, that is again a very important question. So if you advocate around land rights, definitely that's also a very important task. Either you do it in Europe, or even if you do it in the local context. You can also monitor, for example, we as HAND, as the association of those NGOs, those development NGOs, Hungarian NGOs, who work in the field, we are kind of entrusted with the task of monitoring for example, the spending of Hungary or the European Union. So you can have as an NGO or a CSO a watchdog role. That's also very important because you can hold governments, the EU, decision makers, private companies sometimes accountable. I think I already mentioned capacity building. That's also a very important role. As, for example, donor country-based NGOs, it's a very important field for us. We go there in partnership with the local NGOs, in an ideal case. We figure out that what kind of capacities are missing, where we can intervene in such a way that with absolute ownership and partnership, we can see that the local, for example, CSO sector could develop and improve their situation. Another very important role is resource mobilization. Absolutely, many donor country-based NGOs from the north, they do only that. They collect money and they send to local partners, and that's how development is realized. So you can see that there are many aspects to the CSO work in development cooperation.
Yeah, definitely. What would you say? How could these NGOs be more effective? What do they need to be able to participate more in international development cooperation?
If you're talking about specifically the Hungarian sector, I've been watching the development and the context, the life of Hungarian development NGOs for almost 20 years, as I said. So if we talk about them, definitely one crucial point is funding, low funding at the moment. 20 years ago, it was really a kind of pioneer work, and even the government was providing such kind of funding for NGOs, which was unprecedented before. So in that sense, quite many NGOs, small NGOs, bigger ones, middle-sized NGOs, they came together. There was one time when we had like, I don't know, almost 30 members of HAND. At the moment, we have only 13. So that is also a kind of characteristic of the situation. So in the very beginning, that was very visible that the kind of will is also on the side of the government to build up the NGO sector, to provide ample funding and to facilitate the kind of field work and the implementing work which can be done by NGOs. After some time, because of the economic crisis in 2008 and because of other aspects also interfering, that type of enthusiasm on the government side, that was kind of fading. So, for example, from 2015, funding has become scarcer for NGOs, and specifically for implementing development projects from Hungarian government funds, that has become kind of difficult. In that sense, a kind of a turning point was the establishment of the Hungary Helps program and the Hungary Helps agency in 2019 and 20. So I think there's again a kind of turning point, and things are getting better and better, but at the same time there are kind of phases in these 20 years, and some phases were favorable for NGOs, some not that much, and funding was absolutely a key point in them. Definitely we need longer term projects, longer term programs in the beginning as well, but nowadays too, projects are only for 1 year. For that type of strategic approach, which is needed for development cooperation, that's absolutely not favorable. Because the funding and the kind of capacity building approach from the government side or from the authorities side, which is at the moment is kind of lacking. So because of the lack of these factors, definitely a kind of diversification process, which is needed for a healthy NGO sector, has not really gone through. with the Hungarian sector. That's not the case, for example, in Czech Republic or in Slovak Republic. So, for example, in their platforms, similar type of national platforms like HAND, they have 30, 40, 50 members of development NGOs. So in our case, the sector is small and it's not diversified. So basically, usually the usual suspects are supported by the government, and they can have the kind of access to government funding. And I think that should absolutely be changed, that situation. Definitely, we should also, as NGO sector, but the government too can improve that situation to facilitate the access to international resources like EU funding. That's also crucial, because if we compare it with the Slovak or the Czech sector, definitely they are much more successful in competing for EU funding. Facilitating international partnerships to partner for implementing development projects in developing countries. That's also a key factor in being successful as a development NGO. So all these factors are very much important for improving or developing the Hungarian NGO sector, and that should be a kind of complex capacity building approach on the side of the government, which includes also consultations with NGOs. It's very important that both the NGOs should be aware of government expectations, and the government should also be aware of the NGO needs for an effective NGO sector.
Well, I have read the recently released OECD peer review, which really reassured your thoughts on long-term funding and more flexible funding. But what would you say about, since you're the professional who can see this through, has the amount of NGOs working, especially in Africa, since I'm also training here at Foundation for Africa, so has this amount of NGOs working there changed over the last couple of years compared to other international development sectors?
Specifically, the number of NGOs working in Africa. As I told you at the very beginning, funding was really kind of ample. So there was a kind of peak in the numbers of NGOs, again, specifically working in Africa. Because everybody was expecting, more and more government funding to have the resources to go to Africa and work there or in other parts. At that time, there were NGOs, it's like 20, 15 years back. There were NGOs also working in Asia, not so much, but of course there were NGOs working in Europe. So absolutely in the Balkans, in Ukraine, that was a characteristic of Hungarian NGOs. Many of those NGOs active in the Balkans, they don't exist anymore. So in that sense, there was a decline also, and with the diminishing government funding, there was a decline in the number of NGOs working in Africa as well. This kind of turning point happened, which I mentioned, that the Hungary Helps program was established and the Hungary Helps agency was established, because that kind of counteracted this downward trend. And now I can see at least, 10, 15 NGOs interested in working in Africa, for example, around 2012 or something. So I think it's a promising trend, definitely. What I kind of don't like, that it's mainly focused on Africa. So I think it would be very important to have a kind of fraction of the Hungarian NGO sector to work in Europe as well. In the Balkans, in Ukraine, specifically with the war there. So that's also changing, definitely kind of hopeful. We'll see about other parts of the world.
Yeah, well, hopefully that will happen. Given these difficulties and also possibilities that you mentioned, would you say that there is a bigger demand for joint projects from the government side or from the civil society side? What could you say about that?
Yes, usually as NGO, you don't work with the government. Usually they provide you funding so they work through you as an implementer, and that's how you kind of cooperate. But if you're talking about implementing something in partnership with other sectors, like NGOs cooperate with private sector, like companies, that's absolutely that there's a demand. Specifically on the side of the NGOs, because they also have the kind of notion that private companies, they might have the proper funding. But again, if you look at the statistics and the numbers of the DAC of the OECD, it's still not really the case. So somehow the kind of private companies which are interested in going to Africa, building ties with Africa or with other parts or other developing regions of the world, it's still kind of limited. And however much the government does really a lot to help them and to assist them to grow to that type of being that type of private sector actor that is capable of doing that and going to Africa and building economic ties there, it somehow still does not really happen to the extent the government is also expecting, and basically NGOs would also like to see. At the same time, there's another question here, because in many cases, you can have such kind of approach on the side of private companies, which are not in line with the approach of CSOs. So definitely a kind of trust building is an important issue in that regard, but at the same time, definitely due diligence and the kind of approach which is needed for international development cooperation, which is not only profit-oriented. So that type of perception is also needed on the side of private sector as well. So I think, again, here, a lot to improve, and there's so much room for improvement and development still.
So we could say that this is a very much untapped opportunity to work them together, but there are many difficulties. And
there are many difficulties, yeah, in that regard. And for example, I think on the side of private companies, I'm not so sure that there is a demand for cooperation with CSOs. But this is exactly because of the kind of lack of knowledge, how CSOs could help my case, how they can be a kind of asset while implementing something in Africa. So if that type of knowledge is missing, definitely they will not seek out NGO partners. Of course, the bigger NGOs, the big humanitarian, very experienced NGOs, those 5, 6, which exist in Hungary, they have this type of knowledge and these type of ties. But that again, it's kind of limited.
I see. Well, thank you so much. That has been very elaborate on the whole topic. This was the first part of our podcast. Thank you for listening. In the second part, we will talk about personal experiences, purposes, and ways to get involved in international development cooperation.